All right, so the Community Preservation Act is going to be in the general election on the ballot this year, November 5th, 2024, and it's going to be ballot question number 6. Beginning with some background information about the CPA, it's been around for about 25 years now. 196 communities have adopted the CPA, and that includes about 70% of the population of the state. In that time, about $3.15 billion has been raised that has gone to those 196 communities, of which Sherborn is not one currently. But this past year, at the annual town meeting, we did pass the CPA warrant article, so it is on the ballot this year. And Sherborn is one of 13 communities in Massachusetts that will be voting on CPA this November. How does the CPA work? So there are two arms. The first one is the local revenue, and this is the part that directly will affect all of the residents and taxpayers of Sherborn. The way that this works is there is a surcharge of 1% on your annual tax bill. So whatever your annual tax bill is, you take 1% of that total, and there will be another separate surcharge which totals that amount. It does not actually increase the tax rate because it is considered outside of the tax bill. Of course, you are still paying it, but in terms of if people look up what is the tax rate in Sherborn, the CPA surcharge is not part of the tax rate. There are exemptions that were also passed at the town meeting. So the first $100,000 of value, whether it's residential or commercial or industrial, is exempted from the calculation. And there are also exemptions for low-income residents as well as moderate-income senior residents. And those are based on your eligibility for subsidized housing in Massachusetts. The second arm is the Community Preservation Trust Fund, and this is really the key to the whole thing. There are state matching funds, so depending on how much the community raises, the state is also going to match a certain percentage of what we raise with our CPA surcharges. And this is paid for with a surcharge on all real estate transactions at the Registry of Deeds, and it's $50 per transaction. So essentially anybody who has purchased land in Sherborn over the past 25 years has already paid into this Community Preservation Trust Fund, but has not received anything back for it because Sherborn currently has not adopted the CPA. So this is a busy chart. Don't worry too much about all the specifics here, but it kind of gives you an overview over the first 20 years or so of CPA of how much money has been distributed. The key is to note that over the course of the 20 years here, on average, the state has matched about 52% of what the local revenue has raised. And over the past 5 years, it's been about 31%. You'll notice that in the early years, it was 100% match from the state because there weren't a lot of towns that were in the program, and that has steadily dropped over time. But then you'll see that in recent years, the state legislature has voted to add some additional surplus funds, with the goal being to keep the state match somewhere in the 30 to 40% range. And so you'll see at the last couple of years here, it's been around high 30% range. So how would this work in Sherborn? Based on fiscal year 2023 tax data, so this is last year's information, the average home value was around $1 million and the average tax bill was a hair under $18,000. So using those as our basis for calculation, if you look at this chart, the two important things to note are the CPA surcharge per home, which you'll see is $160. And then the total CPA revenue, which is around $295,000. So what this means is that the average homeowner in Sherborn is going to pay $160 per year. That's the entire year's CPA surcharge. And with that, plus the CPA trust fund state matching funds, we are estimating that we would be raising around $295,000 per year. What can we spend that $295,000 on? So there are 3 categories that are allowed with CPA. So one is open space and recreation. The second is historic preservation. And then the third is community housing or affordable housing. We are required to spend 10% of the CPA funds on each of those 3 categories. And then the remaining 70% can be spent on any of those 3 categories. So it's up to the town to determine how we want to prioritize the use of the funds. So if we wanted to spend 80% of it on open space and recreation, we could do that. If we wanted to spend 80% of it on historic preservation, we could do that. So there's a pretty decent amount of flexibility. So here we have a little bit of additional detail for each of those categories, what activities the funds can be spent on. So as you can see, of course, for all categories, you can acquire or preserve those categories using your CPA funds. Obviously, you cannot create new historic buildings, but otherwise you can use the CPA funds to create all of these things. Support for affordable housing, that means that if we created a fund as sort of financial aid for rental for people who maybe are having trouble with that, we can use CPA funding for that type of support. And then rehabilitation and restoration of both historic and recreation. But with open space and housing, we can't use the CPA to rehabilitate or restore existing land unless it was created with CPA to begin with. So looking at projects that Sherborn has historically paid for already and going back through fiscal year 2000, so essentially from the beginning of CPA, looking at what has the town spent capital money on and which of those things would have been eligible for CPA funding. And the key is that over that time, on average, we have spent about $275,000 per year on projects that retrospectively deemed would have been eligible for CPA funds. And so you can see that that kind of closely matches the amount of revenue that we would expect to generate moving forward with our 1% surcharge, which was $295,000. Looking at potential projects, so this is based on our 5-year capital plan. The top 5 things were all items that were up for votes at this past year's annual town meeting. And then I picked out a few things in the upcoming years that should be eligible for CPA. And so you can see right there, there's at least $300,000 worth of stuff. And then the Sherborn History Museum, we don't actually know what the final cost will be, but that would certainly be eligible for CPA funding as well. So some examples of things that other towns have done with their CPA funds. In Concord, they did a full restoration of their townhouse. In East Hampton, they created a walking trail, which is also wheelchair accessible, which I think has been very nice for their community. In Goshen, they created senior housing. That was a project that they saved up CPA money for several years before they were able to build the whole project. I believe that something like a Woodhaven 2 in Sherborn would be a pretty popular project that we could spend CPA money on. And then in many communities, they have built pickleball courts and or have rehabilitated their tennis courts. So those are all some examples of things that CPA money can be used on. So how do we actually implement it? At the annual town meeting, we passed the CPA, and so now it goes on to the November ballot. If it should pass, be approved on the election, then at the upcoming annual town meeting in 2025, we would then establish a community preservation committee, which has to be composed of at least one member from each of the following committees: the Planning Board, the Affordable Housing Trust, the Conservation Commission, the Historical Commission, and the Recreation Commission. And that committee then would be required to hold an annual public hearing where they hear the community's requests for what types of projects they would want the CPA funds to be spent on. And then the Community Preservation Committee would then determine which of those projects they would sponsor to go onto the annual town meeting warrant. Each project would be its own warrant article, and it would go through the full vetting process as any other town meeting warrant article would go through, and would need to be passed with a vote at the town meeting. So the town still maintains full control over how the money is used. The great advantage of this whole project is essentially that funding via borrowing, which is what we have done historically and would be doing in the future for any future capital projects if we did not pass the CPA, ultimately costs 53% more than funding the same project through the CPA. And on the next slide, I'm going to go through that calculation for you. Try to follow along here. If we imagine that $295,000, which is the amount that we expect to generate from at least the first year of CPA funds, if we were to approve a project that cost exactly that much, and we did a 20-year bond on it at a 4.5% interest rate, which is approximately what the bond rates for recent Sherborn projects has been. The annual debt service on that bond would be $22,678. And in total, over 20 years, we would be paying $158,000 in interest on that $295,000 bond. So that annual debt service of $22,000, if we divide that by our current tax rate, which we are getting essentially every $18,000 is 1 penny on the tax rate. So that annual debt service is about 1.24 cents on our tax rate. So on the average tax bill for Sherborn residents, if you remember that the average household value was around $1 million. So the average house then would be paying $12.26 on their annual bill over 20 years for that debt service, which would be $245 over 20 years, compared with $160 that we would have paid using CPA. And so that difference is 53%. So to me, this is really the big clincher, which is that if we can pay for certain projects using CPA instead of borrowing, which is what we have done in the past, we can essentially save 53% on those projects, which I think would be a great thing for the town. So if you have any further questions about the CPA, please feel free to email sherborncpa@gmail.com. And I or any other members of the Support Sherborn CPA Committee, and that's myself is the chair, Steve Violin is the treasurer, and Marian Neutra is a third member. One of us would be happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much.